Get these people out. They're trying to scam us with their so-called trust fund." The bank manager shouts silences the lobby as everyone turns to watch a black family humiliated, legal papers in hand, security closing in to drag them out like criminals. No one asks their side. No one cares. Want to know how this ends? Hit like, subscribe for more stories like this, and tell us in the comments where you're watching from and what you think happens next. Robert Sanders stood at the gleaming marble counter of Redwood National Bank, the grand lobby around him humming with hushed conversations and the occasional click of polished shoes. The chandeliers overhead threw cold, brilliant light onto the brass fixtures, giving the entire place an air of unearned nobility. The morning had begun like any other. Customers in tailored suits checking their balances, the rich exchanging knowing nods, and the staff moving with rigid precision to maintain the illusion of deference. But that carefully staged harmony was about to be ruptured the moment a family walked in. David Robinson held the heavy oak doors for his mother and younger sister, ensuring they entered first. Their steps were calm, measured, reflecting the kind of dignity you don't boast about but carry naturally. His mother, Evelyn Robinson, wore a neat cream blouse and gray skirt, her hair tied back in a functional bun. His sister Lila, a college sophomore, clutched the folder with her trust documentation, the thick manila edge showing where from being opened and closed so many times in preparation for today. David took a breath before stepping in, feeling the bank's air conditioning cut against the Atlanta summer heat. Immediately, the atmosphere shifted. Conversations dimmed ever so slightly. Eyes trailed over their clothes, not ragged, but modest, lacking the flamboyance that wealthier usually wore like armor. A teller near the back whispered something to a colleague, her eyes flicking back to them. Robert Sanders noticed them instantly from his post at the center counter. His face did not register surprise. It registered calculation. He adjusted the cuffs of his navy blue suit and smiled in that curated way he did for everyone, but it faltered before it reached his eyes. "Good morning," David greeted him with a nod, laying the folder on the counter. "We have an appointment to release our trust fund. I called yesterday. It's under Robinson Family Trust." Robert blinked once, deliberately slow, and took in the family. He didn't even glance at the folder. Instead, he shifted his gaze over David's shoulders, as if looking for an adult to appear. "I'm sorry, you said trust fund?" His tone was casual on the surface, but sharpened underneath like a razor hiding in soft cloth. Evelyn cleared her throat politely. "Yes, Mr. Sanders. We have a scheduled release today. The documents are all here." Robert still didn't look at the folder. He clicked his tongue against the roof of his mouth and let out a faint laugh, eyes scanning the growing line behind them for effect. "And you're saying you have a trust fund worth how much?" His voice carried. Heads turned. The hush spread wider. David inhaled carefully, controlling the flush in his ears. $2.5 million, he said evenly, voice low but firm. Robert let out an audible breath through his nose, smirking slightly. $2.5 million. Right. He nodded slowly, theatrically, tapping his pen against the marble. "And you're sure about that number? That's not a typo?" A couple waiting nearby exchanged glances. The old man in the chair across the lobby lifted his newspaper just a little higher to listen, without seeming to. Evelyn's back stiffened. She looked Robert squarely in the eye. "There's no typo. We've maintained this trust for 20 years. It was established by my father for my children." Robert finally deigned to pick up the folder. He flipped it open without reading, glanced at the first page, then dropped it back onto the counter like it was trash. He murmured, unimpressed. "Sure, okay. I'll have to validate this. Just a moment." He turned without waiting for a reply and walked off, leaving them stranded at the counter, a spotlight of silence growing around them. Other customers watched openly now. A mother shifted her child behind her as if the Robinsons posed a threat. A suited man in line scoffed and checked his watch dramatically. David felt his palms heating up. He turned to his mother and sister. "Don't react," Evelyn whispered urgently, fingers squeezing his wrist. "Stay calm." Lila blinked back frustration, hugging the folder to her chest. "He's humiliating us on purpose," she said, voice cracking. "He wants us to lose it." David swallowed. He closed his eyes for half a second, centering himself. His father's words rang in his head from so many years ago. They'll test your patience because they know your anger is the only thing that can disqualify you. When Robert returned, he carried a new air of authority, a taller bank security guard following a step behind. Robert didn't address the guard directly, but made sure he stood just close enough to intimidate. So Robert began in a voice meant for everyone nearby to hear. "I've checked our system, and this doesn't appear to match our records. Are you sure you're in the right bank?" Evelyn's mouth fell open in disbelief. "We've banked here for over 20 years. Robert smiled, wolfish and polite. "Ma'am, please lower your voice. We wouldn't want to cause a disturbance." David felt his jaw tighten so hard it hurt. The security guard shifted his weight meaningfully. Lila wiped at her eyes with her sleeve. Robert continued, "You have to understand. A sum like that, it attracts, shall we say, bad actors. I'm simply ensuring that Redwood National Bank maintains its standards." He let the word hang in the air. Standards. Everyone listening knew exactly what that meant. The silence in the lobby was charged, buzzing with second-hand embarrassment that was really complicity. David exhaled slowly, controlling his voice. "We'd like to speak to your branch manager." Robert blinked. Then, in a moment of open mockery, he tilted his head with exaggerated confusion. "Branch manager? Sir, you're looking at him." He spread his arms wide, feigning magnanimity. "So you're already speaking to the best we have to offer." Evelyn's face hardened to stone. "Then we want the regional office number. Now." Robert's eyes narrowed, the smile finally slipping. The game stopped being fun. "You know what?" he said, voice dropping so only they could hear. "I'm going to suspend the account until this can be verified properly. For your safety, of course." He typed with deliberate slowness, each keystroke like a bullet. "And while that's happening, I'd advise you to leave the premises. We don't want to make anyone uncomfortable." David's vision blurred for a moment. The guard shifted closer. "Sir," the guard murmured, "let's keep this civil." Robert met David's gaze, unblinking, certain he'd won. Around them, the lobby exhaled, pretending to go back to normal but not missing a second of the show. David swallowed rage like broken glass, turned to his family, and led them toward the door, his arm firmly around his sister's shaking shoulders. Robert Sanders watched them leave the counter area with that smug, practiced smile still hanging on his lips, but behind the polished facade his eyes were cold and calculating, tracking every move as David guided his mother and sister toward the uncomfortable chairs near the lobby window. The hush of the room slowly resuming its measured tempo, but not before the damage was done. The people watching pretended to avert their gaze, yet they stole glances, whispering, making silent judgments as if the family had wandered into a world that did not want them. Robert leaned back against the counter, tapping a manicured fingernail against the laminated schedule of appointments as he pressed a button under the desk that buzzed discreetly to the security office in the back hall, the signal unmistakable to the staff who were trained to read its coded language. Watch them, track them, make sure they don't make trouble. And it wasn't 5 seconds before a tall man in a pressed gray uniform named. Sam cut across the back of the room pretending to check the vault door while his gaze slid over to the Robinsons, sharp and unblinking, catching the twitch in David's clenched jaw, the subtle way Evelyn held her purse close, the nervous flick of Lila's eyes from face to face around them. Sam didn't move aggressively, but he didn't leave either, lingering in the periphery like a threat wrapped in politeness. Robert knew how it worked. He didn't need to say a word to make them feel smaller than the antique rugs they stood on, to make them question every reason they'd ever had for coming here at all. He picked up the folder they'd left behind on the counter with a feigned, thoughtful expression and began flipping through it just as 2 more tellers shifted registers to help the growing line, not out of necessity, but to ensure every angle of the Robinson family was in full view. So if they so much as raised their voice or lost their temper, there'd be 3 witnesses ready to swear they'd been threatening. The thick, oppressive air of the lobby tightening like a fist, the hush broken only by the muted chime of the entrance door as new customers filed in, brushing past the family without meeting their eyes. Robert exhaled, deliberately slow, giving the impression of a man burdened by responsibility, by the need to ensure the integrity of the institution, then turned to Sam with a low voice only just above a whisper. "Just make sure they don't wander," he said, not meeting the guard's eyes because he didn't need to. His voice carried authority, like the crack of a whip, and Sam nodded once, moving closer to the edge of the seating area, arms folded, pretending to watch the entire room while his gaze never strayed far from the Robinsons. Meanwhile, David sat stiffly, trying to keep his leg from bouncing, his teeth grinding behind pursed lips. Feeling the prickle of every stare in the room as if they were knives, Evelyn placed a calming hand on his knee, her voice low and urgent. "Don't give them what they want," she murmured, and he swallowed hard, nodding, but his eyes burned. Lila tried to shrink into herself, clutching the folder tight enough that the edges cut into her palms, blinking furiously against the hot tears gathering in her eyes. At the counter, Robert pretended to study their papers, tilting them at angles, squinting as if deciphering ancient text, but he was barely reading at all. The performance was for them and for anyone who might be watching, an elaborate show of due diligence that served only to deepen the humiliation. Finally, he exhaled dramatically, letting the papers fall with a muted slap against the counter. He said loudly enough for the nearby customers to hear. "This is unusual." He paused, savoring the moment before calling out in a voice tinged with forced patience. "David, could you come back over here for a second?" David rose slowly, his mother's grip on his wrist lingering for a heartbeat before releasing. He walked a few feet with the slow, deliberate steps of someone approaching a trap they couldn't avoid, standing at the counter with his shoulders tight, eyes locked on Robert's face, refusing to look down or away even though he wanted to spit at the man's shoes. Robert didn't offer so much as a nod of greeting, just regarded him with that irritating smirk, eyes sweeping him from head to toe as if assessing his worth like livestock at auction before finally settling on David's face with theatrical sympathy. "So," he drawled, "you said you're managing this trust?" David didn't blink. "Yes. It was set up by my grandfather for our family." Robert's eyebrows shot up with mocking surprise. "Really?" he said, lips twitching at the corners. "Your grandfather was very generous." He let the word hang, poisonous and heavy, then leaned in just a fraction, lowering his voice to an intimate, conspiratorial level that somehow made it feel more insulting. "Do you even know what a trust fund is, David?" For a split second, the air around them froze. David's eyes narrowed, the muscle in his jaw jumped, but he didn't speak immediately. Instead, he forced himself to exhale slowly through his nose, remembering his mother's warning, remembering the guard standing close enough to intervene at the first sign of raised voices. "I know exactly what it is," David said, voice cold and controlled, each word deliberate as a hammer strike. "I also know you're stalling." Robert's mouth twitched, his eyes gleaming with amusement at the barely restrained fury. "Stalling? Oh no, David," he said, drawing out the name as if it were a joke. "I'm making sure Redwood National doesn't become a victim of fraud. It's my job to verify these things. After all," he added, voice rising just enough to carry to the eavesdropping customers, "we don't want to make any errors with this amount of money, right?" He let the word this drip with scorn, as if $2.5 million were an absurd fantasy for people like David to even dream about. And the suited man in line made a small, snorting laugh, checking his watch as if personally inconvenienced by their very presence. David's knuckles whitened on the edge of the counter. He was aware of the room, of the way every sound felt amplified. The squeak of leather chairs, the murmur of the teller counters, the quiet snickers from behind magazines. He felt humiliated, exposed, and for the first time, truly angry at himself for believing for even a moment that a folder of papers and a scheduled appointment would earn them respect here. Robert watched all of this with clinical satisfaction before letting out a long, suffering sigh, snapping the folder shut with a decisive clap, and turning his head to address Sam with false weariness. "Could you help our guests find somewhere to wait while I finish these verifications?" Sam straightened immediately, stepping forward with the slow, menacing ease of someone who had performed this pantomime 1,000 times before. "Of course," he said, voice syrupy polite, but eyes hard as stone, gesturing with an open palm toward the waiting area. "Right this way, folks." David's nostrils flared as he turned to go, catching Robert's smirk as the man began typing something on his screen that he didn't even bother to hide. An email to security, to legal, to whomever would help cement the message that Redwood National didn't want them here, not really, not at all, that their money wasn't enough to buy them the illusion of belonging, that they were trespassers in suits. And even as David walked back to his family, with the guard shadowing him, his mother's fingers trembling as she wiped at her eyes, and Lila pressed the folder to her chest like a shield. The sound of Robert's condescending laugh floated after them, a poisonous fog that seeped into every crack of their composure, reminding them this fight was only just beginning. Robert Sanders sat back down at the grand, polished counter after sending David and his family to the waiting area, with Sam shadowing them like an obedient guard dog. But instead of resuming any real work, he took a moment to stretch and glance around the bank floor, ensuring the other customers were watching with a kind of smug delight he didn't bother to hide. He wanted them to see the show he was staging, because nothing reinforced Redwood National Bank's standards like a public demonstration of who did and didn't belong. Once he saw the family settle stiffly into the uncomfortable chairs, he picked up the desk phone and punched in a few numbers with deliberate slowness, never breaking eye contact with them across the lobby, the plastic receiver pressed to his ear like a prop on a stage. Then he let out a dramatic sigh and spoke loud enough to carry over the quiet background hum of conversation. "Yes, this is Robert Sanders at Redwood National. I need to verify something." His voice was falsely pleasant at first, but he quickly let it slip into condescension. "I have some people here claiming they're entitled to access a $2.5 million trust." He paused, letting the words hang heavy in the air like an accusation, knowing full well every head within 10 feet would turn at the mention of that number. Evelyn's eyes widened and she squeezed David's wrist so hard he felt her nails dig in, willing him to stay silent as his face burned with fury. Lila blinked rapidly, tears welling, her grip tightening on the battered folder in her lap. Robert glanced at them with that smug half-smile and kept going, tapping his pen noisily for punctuation. "Yes, they claim it's theirs, but honestly, I doubt it's legitimate." He drawled that last phrase with sickening relish, each syllable designed to humiliate them further, and the lobby fell into that strained hush that wasn't real silence so much as collective voyeurism. People shifting in their chairs, pretending not to eavesdrop while hanging onto every word. An older woman in a floral hat across the room sucked her teeth disapprovingly without knowing a single fact about the family. A suited businessman muttered, "Unbelievable," under his breath while pretending to read his phone, and the teller closest to Robert ducked her head, pretending to count bills so she wouldn't have to meet anyone's eyes. Robert let the fake call drag on, feigning exasperation as if dealing with criminals was simply part of his daily grind. "Yes, yes, I'll hold," he said loudly, rolling his eyes theatrically and letting out a humorless laugh for the benefit of his growing audience. He drummed his fingers while glancing at the family, meeting David's murderous glare with unbothered amusement. Evelyn sat rigid, her lips pressed in a bloodless line, visibly shaking from the effort not to scream, and Lila, so young and trying so hard to be grown, wiped at her face and refused to look at anyone at all. Robert leaned back in his chair with a sigh so exaggerated it practically vibrated the polished marble counter. "Honestly, you'd think people would know better than to waste everyone's time with this nonsense," he said to no one in particular, but loud enough for everyone to hear. And a couple at the back of the line tittered uncomfortably, trying to hide their smiles behind polite hands. He finally ended the call with a crisp snap of the receiver and shook his head like a disappointed father, clicking open their folder one more time with faux interest before slamming it shut with a dismissive thud, the sound sharp and final. "All right," he said in a voice that brooked no argument. "Let's not waste any more of Redwood National's resources." He glanced at Sam, giving him a small nod that was practically a command. "Let's help our guests find the exit," he added in a falsely courteous tone dripping with poison. Sam understood immediately, straightening his back and stepping forward with deliberate calm, his broad chest blocking out half the light as he moved toward the Robinsons. David tensed, muscles coiling like a spring about to snap, but Evelyn's hand locked onto his wrist with surprising strength. She didn't speak, she just shook her head once, eyes burning with humiliated rage and pleading all at once. The message clear: don't let them win, not like this. Sam cleared his throat, adopting a professional mask as he addressed them in a voice he'd used 100 times before to eject the undesirable without technically breaking any rules. "Folks," he began smoothly, "I'm going to have to ask you to come with me." His words were polite, but his tone wasn't a request at all. It was an order softened by the pretense of customer service. David's nostrils flared as he forced his voice into an icy calm. "We're waiting for the verification you're supposedly doing," he shot back, every syllable shaking with the effort not to raise his voice and give Robert the spectacle he craved. But Robert was already standing, folding his arms with the air of a man forced to deal with petty criminals at great personal inconvenience. "Mr. Robinson," he called, tone formal and sneering, "you're disrupting other customers by insisting on this charade. Redwood National won't tolerate disorderly conduct." The words were a snake wrapped in velvet, full of faux concern, but aimed to paint them as threats, as troublemakers, as criminals who needed to be removed for the safety of decent people. He gestured meaningfully toward Sam, who moved closer, shadow swallowing the small circle of chairs where the family sat huddled. Lila whimpered, voice cracking as she tried to say something, but Evelyn silenced her with a squeeze of her shoulder, her eyes locked on Robert, refusing to let him see her cry even as tears welled and spilled. David stood finally, slow and deliberate, muscles taut as he towered over the seated Sam for a moment before stepping back. His hands raised slightly in surrender even as his glare burned holes in Robert's skull. "We're not making a scene," he bit out, voice thick with disgust. "You are." Robert smiled, all teeth, spreading his hands as if he were the reasonable one. "We're just trying to maintain the dignity of this establishment," he said sanctimoniously, voice raised enough to remind every watching customer exactly who was the civil party here. "Now please leave before we have to escalate further." The threat was thinly veiled but unmistakable, a promise of police and headlines and charges if they didn't go quietly. Sam didn't even need to touch them, his bulk and the smirk under his professional mask said it all, and David knew when he'd lost this battle but not the war. So he turned back to his family, voice shaking as he said, "Let's go." Evelyn and Lila gathered themselves with as much dignity as they could salvage, Lila pressing the folder so tight against her chest the corners bent and creased irreparably, and they began the long, humiliating walk toward the exit, every step echoing off marble like gunshots in the hush, the eyes of strangers on them like weights they couldn't shrug off. Robert watched them go with a satisfied exhale, smoothing down his tie as he murmured something under his breath to the nearby teller, who giggled nervously but didn't dare ask him to repeat it, the automatic. Doors hissed open to the bright sun outside, but the air felt colder than any bank vault they'd ever entered. David's hand hovered over his sister's shoulder, not quite touching, but offering what comfort he could manage as Evelyn fought to keep her head high. Sam followed them just far enough to ensure they didn't turn back, then returned to Robert's side, offering a nod of silent complicity that sealed the performance. Robert exhaled, tapping the counter twice like a conductor ending a symphony, then resumed his place behind the desk as the bank seemed to breathe again, pretending nothing had happened at all even as the gossip spread like wildfire among the customers still waiting in line, their curiosity satisfied, their sense of superiority reaffirmed by the show they'd just been offered. They barely cleared the polished glass doors before David turned to his mother and sister, his voice low but shaking with rage as he hissed, "We're not letting them do this." Evelyn squeezed his wrist hard enough to hurt, her voice like steel wrapped in silk. David not here. Her eyes flickered to the lobby, where they could see Robert still behind the counter smirking like a king on his throne, customers glancing out through the glass, pretending not to stare while savoring the spectacle. But David was already moving, pacing along the sidewalk outside the branch like a caged animal, chest heaving. "He humiliated us in front of everyone," he spat, running a hand over his hair. "He called us liars, thieves." Lila sniffled, clutching the battered folder, her voice tiny. "We have the papers, David, it's ours." Her words cracked, and he softened for a moment, putting a hand on her shoulder. I know. Baby, I know." But the rage didn't go away. It just simmered lower more. "Dangerous." Evelyn took a slow breath and let it out, drawing herself up to her full height, her blouse now wrinkled from the rough handling, her eyes hard and clear. "We're going back in," she said flatly, and David blinked at her. "What?" he demanded, incredulous. "He'll just call security again." But Evelyn shook her head slowly. "We're not letting them steal from us." Her voice was quiet, but it had the weight of finality that silenced him. Lila wiped her nose on her sleeve, nodded shakily, and followed as Evelyn turned on her heel and marched back toward the door. Inside, the bank felt colder than before, the hush even more pronounced. Customers pretending to look at brochures or their phones while their eyes tracked the returning family like hawks. Robert was already raising an eyebrow as they approached, settling back in his chair with exaggerated calm. "Oh," he drawled, voice lazy and contemptuous. "You're back." David clenched his fists so tight his nails bit into his palms. Evelyn stepped forward before he could speak, her voice cutting through the stillness like a blade. "We have an appointment, we have our documentation, and you will process our trust." Robert's smile was all teeth, polite in the ugliest way possible. "Ma'am," he said with feigned patience, "I told you there's a verification issue." Evelyn didn't flinch, didn't even blink. "We'll wait." "Verify it." "Do your job." Robert's eyes narrowed, his fingers tapping a slow, menacing rhythm on the countertop before he leaned forward conspiratorially, lowering his voice so it carried just enough. "You don't seem to understand how this works," he murmured. "You don't make demands here." David's jaw flexed as he fought the urge to lunge across the counter. Evelyn didn't move, didn't blink. "You have our papers," she repeated icily. "Check them." Robert clicked his tongue, the amusement gone from his face now, replaced by something colder, more dangerous. "You want to check them?" he asked softly. Then louder, with theatrical exasperation. "Fine. Let's do this officially." He swiveled in his chair and typed with sharp, angry jabs at the keyboard, the monitor's glow painting his face in harsh light. Finally, he stopped and folded his hands neatly, smiling like a shark. "I've just flagged the entire account for investigation," he announced brightly, loud enough for the whole room to hear. "That means the trust is frozen until further notice." The words fell like hammers in the silent lobby. Evelyn's lips parted, her voice low and dangerous. "You can't do that." "Without cause," Robert's grin widened. "I just did," he said simply. "Policy allows me to freeze any account that seems fraudulent." Lila gasped. "Fraudulent? It's our money." Robert didn't look at her, didn't acknowledge her at all. His eyes stayed locked on Evelyn. "I suggest you leave now," he added, voice dripping with false sympathy, "before this becomes an issue for law enforcement." David barked a humorless laugh, shaking his head. "Law enforcement? For asking about our own trust." Robert leaned back, spreading his arms as if explaining to a child. "Sir, if you continue to make demands, if you continue to harass my staff and disrupt our customers, I will have no choice but to call the police and report attempted fraud." His voice rose slightly at the last words, deliberately, so every customer within earshot could savor them, so that the words would stick to the family like tar, branding them for anyone listening. Evelyn went still, her spine rigid, voice so cold it felt like ice. "You would call the police on us for accessing money our family earned?" Robert's eyes gleamed with a cruel light. "You don't want to test me, ma'am," he said softly. "This is a respectable establishment. We don't tolerate threats." David sputtered with disbelief. "Threats? You're the one threatening us." But Robert ignored him completely, turning instead to the line of customers now openly staring, offering them an apologetic shrug, as if to say, "Look what I have to deal with." A low murmur spread among them, a buzz of whispered condemnation. Evelyn felt her chest tighten with shame and rage as she scanned the faces, seeing pity in some eyes, but more disgust, more fear, and worse, indifference. Sam the guard reappeared at Robert's subtle hand signal, moving to stand at the family's flank like a wall in a uniform, the unspoken message clear as glass. "You will leave, or you will be forced to." David's eyes flashed with fury, but Evelyn grabbed his wrist so hard he winced, shaking her head minutely, her voice so low it was almost a growl. "Not here, David. Not today." It was then that a teller behind Robert, a young man in a navy blue vest with a crooked name tag that read Caleb, leaned forward slightly, voice low enough that it might have been meant to be private, but clear enough to reach them all the same. "You people should know your place," he muttered, his voice shaking slightly with fear or excitement. Evelyn couldn't tell which, but the words hit like a slap across the face. Lila let out a strangled sob and covered her mouth. David went utterly still, eyes wide with something beyond rage, his breath coming in ragged bursts as he stared at the teller, whose face went red but didn't look away, didn't apologize, didn't even flinch. Robert didn't reprimand him, didn't even acknowledge the outburst. He just smiled slightly, watching the family's composure shatter piece by piece, his fingers drumming that same slow, mocking rhythm on the counter. The bank fell silent again, the hush heavy and ugly, Even the other tellers frozen in place, no one willing to intervene, no one willing to speak up, the air buzzing with complicity and the slow, simmering satisfaction of witnessing someone being put in their place. Evelyn closed her eyes for a moment, drawing in a deep, shaking breath, then opened them, voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. "We're leaving," she whispered. "Not for Robert, not for Sam, not for the gawking customers, but for her children, for David, for Lila," who looked so small and so broken in that moment. She turned on her heel without another word. Head held high even though her vision blurred with unshed tears. David followed a half-step behind, jaw set so hard it ached. Lila clutched the folder like a lifeline, shoulders shaking with every silent sob, and they walked out of Redwood National Bank together, the automatic doors hissing shut behind them with a finality that felt like exile. As the Robinson family made it halfway across the polished lobby floor, Evelyn's head held high despite the tremor in her lip, and David flanking her like an angry sentinel. Sam, the security guard's voice cut through the hush behind them, too calm to be anything but a threat cloaked in politeness. "Excuse me, folks, I'm going to have to ask you to step this way, please." Evelyn froze, her spine stiffening, and David turned slowly, his fists clenched so tight the knuckles went white. "We're leaving," he bit out, voice low. But Sam shook his head with an apologetic shrug that didn't reach his cold eyes. "Manager's orders, ma'am," he said, gesturing toward a narrow side hallway with a single door marked consultation. His tone suggested anything but consultation, and the eyes of the entire lobby were on them again, silent, eager. Hungry for the next part of the show, Evelyn's face paled, but she nodded once, her voice trembling with tightly controlled fury. "Come on," she whispered to her children, and they followed the security guard down the hushed corridor. The sounds of the main lobby fading into a tense silence, broken only by the squeak of her sensible heels and the scuff of David's worn dress shoes against the floor. When they reached the door, Sam didn't open it immediately. Instead, he keyed a small code on a hidden panel, the mechanical beep loud in the silence, then pushed the door inward with a flourish, revealing a sterile, windowless room lit by a single overhead fluorescent bulb so bright it buzzed. The walls were off-white, the floor a dull institutional gray, a small metal table bolted to the floor with 3 cheap plastic chairs arranged around it. David felt his stomach turn. It looked less like a consultation room and more like an interrogation chamber designed to break people without leaving marks. Sam gestured with forced courtesy. "Please have a seat." Evelyn hesitated only a moment before lifting her chin and stepping in first, leading by example, her hand brushing Lila's shoulder to keep her moving. David was last, pausing just long enough to meet Sam's eyes with open disgust before stepping over the threshold. The door clicked shut behind them with a finality that felt like a prison cell slamming shut. For a moment there was silence in the room, the only sound the steady electric hum of the overhead light. Lila sniffled quietly, clutching the battered folder to her chest like a shield. Evelyn closed her eyes and exhaled slowly, trying to calm the furious hammering of her heart. David couldn't sit. Instead, he paced behind the chairs like a caged animal, his hands clenching and unclenching at his sides. Then the door opened again, and Robert Sanders entered with the same smug, professional smile he wore like armor, flanked by another guard who looked just as cold and indifferent as Sam. Robert set a sleek silver tablet on the table and sat slowly, deliberately, folding his hands in front of him. "Let's try this again, shall we?" he said pleasantly, ignoring the fury in David's eyes and the tight line of Evelyn's mouth. His fingers tapped the edge of the tablet idly before he leaned forward, voice soft but edged with steel. "Tell me where you really got the money." Evelyn's eyes flared. "We've told you." But Robert cut her off with a raised hand. "Ma'am, please," he said with a patronizing sigh. "Let's be honest here. This trust isn't something people like you normally have." The words were measured, calculated to slice, to demean, to remind them of every barrier they had ever faced without saying the word he really meant. David slammed his palms on the table, the cheap plastic rattling against the floor bolts. "People like us?" he demanded, voice raw with fury. But Robert didn't even flinch, merely looked at him with mild annoyance. "Your aggression isn't helping your case," he said smoothly, nodding at the guard who stepped closer, hand resting meaningfully on his belt. David forced himself back, breathing hard, his fingers shaking. As he lowered them to his sides, Robert steepled his fingers and leaned back, feigning disappointment. "Now let's try again," he said, voice dripping with false patience. "Where did you really get the money?" Evelyn's voice cracked as she tried to keep it steady. "It was established by my father," she whispered, her throat tight. "He worked for it his whole life." Robert tilted his head, eyes glinting in the harsh light. "Doing what exactly?" he asked slowly, as if speaking to a child who was too dense to understand simple words. Evelyn's lips parted soundlessly before she forced herself to answer. "He was a financial consultant." Robert made a small, dismissive noise in his throat. "Of course he was," he said, scribbling something on the tablet without looking at them. The stylus making short, violent lines across the screen. "And you have proof?" he asked sharply, snapping his eyes up to meet hers. Evelyn jerked her head toward the folder in Lila's trembling hands. "It's all there," she said, voice breaking. Robert smirked slightly, taking the folder with gloved distaste, flipping through the pages as if they were contaminated, lingering on them just long enough to pretend he was. Reading before tossing it back on the table with a thunk that made Lila jump. "It's not convincing," he said coolly. David's voice cracked like a whip. "What the hell is wrong with you?" But Robert only glanced at the guard, who shifted again. The silent threat clear, Evelyn reached for David's arm, voice urgent and low. "Don't," she begged. Robert smiled faintly, watching them fall apart piece by piece, then glanced at the upper corner of the room, where a tiny black dome sat nestled against the ceiling, nearly invisible unless you were looking for it. A red light blinking lazily to indicate recording. He tapped his stylus against the tablet twice, the gesture subtle but deliberate. "For our records," he said smoothly, voice cool and pleasant as ever. "We like to document these conversations for compliance." Evelyn's face went pale as her eyes flicked to the camera, realization hitting her like a physical blow. Lila let out a strangled sob, hugging the folder tighter as if it could protect her from the shame. David's mouth twisted with rage. "You're recording us? Without our consent?" Robert didn't even blink. "Bank policy," he said simply. "We need to make sure no threats are made, no false claims." The lie rolled off his tongue with practiced ease, and David took a step forward, only for the guard to move in sync, cutting him off with military precision. Robert kept talking, voice smooth as oil. "You understand, of course, we'll be keeping this footage on file in case law enforcement needs to review it," he said, watching them flinch with cold satisfaction. "It's really for everyone's safety." Evelyn shook her head slowly, her breath coming in short, horrified gasps. This is harassment," she whispered, but Robert ignored her, instead tapping a few final notes into his tablet, the stylus making an awful scratching sound that filled the silence. Then he looked up, meeting David's eyes dead on. "We're going to need to verify every detail of this so-called trust," he said icily. "And until then, the funds will remain frozen." David's hands shook as he pressed them against the table, leaning in so close their noses almost touched. "You're going to regret this," he growled. Robert didn't move, didn't blink, just smiled, that same cruel, polite smile that had haunted them since the moment they walked in. "We'll see," he murmured, leaning back slowly as the overhead light buzzed and the camera's red eye blinked steadily, recording every humiliating second. Robert Sanders sat back in the narrow plastic chair bolted to the cold floor of the so-called consultation room, his stylus tapping the tablet with the slow, deliberate rhythm of a man who knew he was in total control, watching the Robinson family squirm under the relentless buzz of the overhead fluorescent light and the unblinking red eye of the security camera that continued recording every second of their humiliation. Evelyn's shoulders shook with suppressed rage and shame. Lila hid her face in her hands, muffling sobs that filled the sterile space with a sound raw enough to scrape bone, and David leaned forward, his teeth bared in a snarl he couldn't hide anymore. "We want your supervisor," he ground out, his voice cracking under the weight of everything that had been done to them. But Robert didn't even flinch, his smirk cool and measured as he cocked his head like a curious predator watching wounded prey. "Oh, you want my supervisor?" he repeated, voice so falsely polite it hurt. "To hear. You're looking at him, Mr. Robinson. I am the manager here, and what I say goes." He held up the tablet like it was a scepter, eyes gleaming in the bright light, then set it down and folded his hands with mock patience. "Now, unless you have something new to share about where you got these funds," he continued, enunciating each word slowly and carefully, "I'm going to ask you to wait outside while we verify a few details." David's mouth opened in protest, but Evelyn reached for him, fingers digging into his arm, her voice shaking as she whispered, "Not now, David," the despair in her eyes silencing him more effectively than any threat. Robert watched this exchange with satisfaction before nodding sharply to the guard, who gestured for them to stand and herded them toward the door. As they left the interrogation room, the light felt no less harsh in the corridor. The walls, somehow even closer than before. Robert waited until the door shut with a heavy, echoing click. Then his face dropped a polite mask like a snake shedding dead skin. He snatched the tablet off the table and stood, his steps quick and efficient as he marched back through the bank's staff-only corridor toward his glass-walled office, ignoring the wary glances of tellers who knew better than to make eye contact when he was in this mood. Inside the office, he slammed the door shut hard enough that the blinds rattled, muttering curses under his breath as he dropped into the sleek leather chair behind his immaculate desk, the tablet screen lighting up instantly with a flick of his finger, showing the Robinsons' appointment details, the trust documentation scanned in from the day before, the verification logs, and the timestamp reservation for today's meeting. Irrefutable proof they'd done everything by the book, the evidence that, if left alone, would force Redwood National to honor their request and release the funds. Robert's jaw flexed in fury at the thought, at the insult of them thinking they could simply walk in here with their well-worn clothes and battered folder and demand millions as if the bank existed to serve them. His lip curled in disgust as he began tapping rapidly at the tablet, pulling up the internal staff system, his fingers moving with the skill of someone who had done this kind of thing before. He navigated to the internal scheduler, scrolling until the Robinson name appeared with its unmissable appointment block and attached notes. Then he selected it with a savage jab of his thumb, ignoring the warning pop-up that asked if he was sure he wanted to delete this record. His grin widening as he clicked confirm, without hesitation, the entry disappearing from the log as if it had never existed, leaving no trace of the agreement, no record of the scheduled meeting they'd come prepared for. No proof they'd done anything except show up unannounced and cause trouble. He leaned back for a moment, watching the blank calendar with deep, satisfied breaths, letting the silence of the empty office soak in the finality of what he'd just done. Then he closed the scheduling system and tapped into the client communication log, scrolling until he found the trust record with the attached notes about prior calls, the polite confirmations, the banker's promise to have the paperwork ready, deleting them one by one until the history showed nothing but an unremarkable, incomplete profile flagged for fraud review. Robert's eyes glittered in the screen's pale glow as he navigated next to the branch email system, selecting a blank message and tapping in the internal distribution list for every branch manager in the region. His fingers flew as he typed, each word chosen to sow suspicion and close every door they might try next. "Heads up," he wrote in the subject line, tone falsely casual but unmistakably warning. Had a family in today trying to access a large trust, $2.5 million claimed. Docs looked suspicious, flagged for fraud. They got loud when asked for verification, and security had to intervene. He paused, savoring the lie as he tapped out the next sentence. Might try the same at other branches. Recommend you verify everything carefully. Don't let them pressure you. Redwood National has standards to maintain. He read it over twice, ensuring it sounded professional, neutral enough on the surface, but with every dog whistle intended to raise hackles and set off alarm bells in any manager reading it. Then he added a single damning line at the end. Watch out, they might try this scam elsewhere. He smiled, a cold, satisfied twist of his mouth as he hit send, watching the message dispatched to over 24 other branches with a single tap, sealing the Robinson family's fate across the entire local network of Redwood National. No matter where they went next, they'd be treated with the same suspicion, the same manufactured skepticism. The lie would follow them like a mark branded into their foreheads. Robert exhaled slowly, leaning back in his chair, letting the glow of the screen wash over his smug, self-satisfied face as he imagined the next manager reading that email, sitting up a little straighter, narrowing their eyes at any similar family who dared to think they deserved to be taken seriously. The poison would spread, doing its work invisibly, insidiously, ensuring Redwood National remained unblemished by the embarrassment of serving the wrong sort of people. He reached for his phone, tapping through to the security logs, pulling up the consultation room camera feed, the file already saved and labeled, watching for a moment as the Robinson family squirmed under the harsh light, the soundless recording playing their humiliation back in black and white clarity. Evelyn's lips moving and angry, pleading words that the mic hadn't picked up, Lila wiping tears from her face, David pacing like an animal in a cage. Robert's smile widened slightly, eyes glinting with satisfaction as he pressed save, ensuring the footage would remain on file indefinitely, something he could reference if needed, or share if anyone questioned the story he'd so carefully crafted. With a final tap, he closed the feed, locked his screen, and sat back with a slow, contented sigh, the dull hum of the office AC filling the silence like applause for his performance. Outside the blinds, he could see the lobby returning to its normal rhythm. Customers reassured that order had been restored, the troublemakers gone, the illusion of civility carefully preserved. Outside the glass doors of Redwood National Bank, the hot afternoon sun hit the Robinson family with a force that made them squint and pause on the concrete landing, their shoulders hunched, and their clothes rumpled from the hours of silent war inside. Evelyn wiped a trembling hand over her face, smearing the remnants of her tears, and Lila sniffled wetly, pressing the battered folder to her chest, as if she could squeeze the humiliation out of it by sheer will. David stood just behind them, eyes locked on the polished doors that still reflected their broken shapes back at them like a cruel joke. His chest heaved with uneven breaths, every muscle in his arms trembling with the need to turn around and storm back in. But something in his mother's defeated posture made him stop, just for a moment, to look at her, really look at her, and see how deeply this day had hurt her in ways he knew it would echo for years if he let it. He exhaled sharply through his nose, rage turning to cold, sharpened purpose in his eyes. Then slowly he reached into his jacket pocket, pulling out his phone with hands that were steady now, too steady, the kind of steady that came from years of learning when you had no other choice but to stay calm when you wanted to scream. Evelyn blinked at him, confused, her brows knitting together. "David?" she asked, her voice hoarse and raw. But David didn't answer immediately. Instead, he turned slightly, so his shadow fell over his sister's tear-streaked face, shielding her from the harsh sun. Then he brought the phone to his ear, the screen lighting up with familiar icons as he scrolled quickly, his voice finally breaking the heavy silence with a low, deliberate edge that made both women freeze. "I think it's time to call Dad." Evelyn's breath hitched audibly at those words, her eyes widening as she took half a step toward him, one hand rising to grab his arm reflexively. "David, no," she said in a harsh whisper, but there was a tremor of desperate hope beneath it. Don't drag him into this unless you're sure." Her voice cracked as she said it, because even she knew there was no one else left to turn to. Not anymore. David met her gaze levelly, his jaw set like granite. "Mom," he said, voice firm but quiet. "So." Only she and Lila could hear. "This is the last time they treat us like this, I promise you." He turned his head slightly, catching Lila's wide, terrified eyes. "Hey," he said more gently. "It's okay. Just hold on to that folder. You did nothing wrong." He waited a beat, watching them, ensuring they heard him, that they believed him. Then he pressed the call button, lifting the phone slowly to his ear, the ringing tone buzzing like electricity through the tense silence between them. It felt like an eternity before the call connected. A faint click followed by a voice so calm, so measured it felt immediately out of place in the raw, exposed moment. Charles Robinson speaking. The voice on the other end said with the slow precision of someone used to being listened to, not interrupted. David exhaled sharply, his shoulders dropping a fraction of their tension. "Hi, Dad," he said, trying to keep his voice even. But there was a rasp there that betrayed the rage and exhaustion simmering just under the surface. "We're going to need your help." There was a beat of silence on the line that felt like the hush before a coming storm. Then Charles Robinson's voice came back, slightly lower, weighted. "Tell me exactly what happened," he ordered gently but firmly. David let out a shaking breath and launched into it, his words clipped and precise, describing every humiliation, every slur, the smirks, the frozen account, the fake call, the backroom interrogation, the camera blinking as they were accused like criminals. His voice cracked once, but he forced it steady again, ending with, "They're refusing to release the trust. They flagged us. Said they'd call the police," he added bitterly. "They wiped the appointment. Made us out like scammers." On the other end there was a long silence, the kind of silence that wasn't indecision but calculation, the silence of a man who had spent decades choosing words that could move markets, that could sink or save governments. Then Charles Robinson spoke, his voice even colder now. "Stay where you are. Don't go back in. I'll handle it." And then, before David could say anything else, the call ended with a soft electronic click, leaving behind only the quiet hissing of the city and the muted chatter inside the bank. Evelyn let out a sound halfway between a sob and a laugh, her eyes shining with relief and worry at the same time. "David, you don't understand what you've done," she whispered fiercely, gripping his arm so hard her knuckles went white. David turned to her, his own eyes glinting with something fierce and unyielding. "I know exactly what I've done," he replied, his voice low and certain. "I'm done playing polite." Inside the bank, Robert Sanders was back behind the counter, his tablet now dark, email sent, record scrubbed, tapping his fingers idly as he watched the door to the lobby swing shut behind the family, the satisfied smirk still playing on his lips. The hush in the room had faded back to the usual banker's quiet, punctuated by the muted clack of keyboards and the low murmur of polite, fraudulent civility. When the door opened again, the chime a bright, mocking note in the hush, Robert looked up, lazily, ready to wave off whoever it was. Then he froze, his fingers stopping mid-tap, his smile slipping in a heartbeat as Charles Robinson stepped through the door with the measured calm of a man who had never been denied anything in his life. His dark suit so precisely tailored it looked like it had been made from the concept of power itself, his eyes scanning the lobby once with surgical precision before settling on Robert with a stare that could freeze rivers. The room fell utterly silent, as if the air itself was holding its breath. Tellers froze with their fingers hovering over keyboards. Customers looked up and blinked, confused, and Robert felt a bead of sweat trickle down the back of his neck despite the bank's frigid AC. He opened his mouth, the first fumbling words of a greeting forming. But Charles Robinson spoke first, his voice deep calm, and so controlled it was terrifying. "I'm looking for the branch manager," he said, though it wasn't a question. Robert swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing visibly. "That would be me, sir," he stammered, hating the crack in his voice. Charles didn't nod, didn't even acknowledge the answer. He simply took a slow, deliberate step forward, the hush in the room thickening with every measured movement. "My name," he continued softly, the word slicing through the air like a blade, "is Charles Robinson, Governor of the Federal Reserve." A collective gasp rippled through the room like wind through dry grass. Someone dropped a pen that clattered against the floor and bounced twice before rolling under a desk unnoticed. The tellers exchanged wide-eyed glances, one of them actually whispering "holy," before clamping a hand over her mouth, and Robert felt his knees weaken slightly, his mouth opening and closing as he tried to process the words, his brain screaming at him that this wasn't possible, that this man wasn't supposed to be here, that no one this important would set foot in his branch, let alone stand in front of him looking at him like he was something to scrape off a shoe. Charles Robinson didn't smile, didn't blink, just let the title hang there in the charged silence, making sure everyone heard it, making sure Robert felt it settling into his bones like cold lead. Charles Robinson's quiet announcement, Governor of the Federal Reserve, hung in the air like a thunderclap that no one had the courage to talk over. The entire bank lobby frozen in a stunned tableau of wide eyes and open mouths. Even the usual low murmur of businesslike whispers and tapping keyboards had died completely, replaced by silence so heavy it felt suffocating. Robert Sanders swallowed convulsively, his eyes flickering to the uniformed security guard who was suddenly standing rigid, gaze locked straight ahead as if terrified to meet his manager's eyes. Behind the glass counter, the tellers had all stopped moving, fingers hovering mid-keystroke, one young woman's mouth hanging open, so long she had to swallow to stop her throat from drying out. Customers shifted uneasily in their chairs or line, heads darting to see better, their curiosity warring with a primal instinct that told them to stay still, to avoid being noticed by the man who had just single-handedly seized the entire room without raising his voice. Charles didn't move immediately. He let the words do their work, let the knowledge of who he was settle over them like a heavy blanket, pressing down on any thought of resistance or argument. His dark eyes locked on Robert with the patient intensity of someone who had made careers rise and fall with a single phone call. He didn't need to yell, didn't need to threaten. All he needed to do was wait for the reality to crash in, and crash it did. Robert's face turned an ugly shade of pale red, blotchy around the collar of his too-tight shirt, the edges of his mouth twitching with words he was too afraid to say, the sweat that had gathered on his hairline now trickling down the side of his face in a clear line. Robert tried to speak, his lips parting once, twice, but the sound that came out was strangled, like someone who had forgotten how words worked entirely. And Charles didn't even blink at the pathetic attempt. Instead, Charles took a single measured step forward, his polished shoes clicking against the immaculate marble floor in a sound that rang out in the dead quiet, making several people jump. He scanned the room once with that same unblinking calm, his gaze moving from teller to teller, customer to customer, until they all flinched and looked away as if burned. He wasn't just looking at them, he was cataloging them, making sure they understood that he saw every single one of them, that he would remember who they were. Then he returned his gaze to Robert with a cold focus of a surgeon ready to cut away something diseased. His voice, when it came, was quiet enough that the silence seemed to bend toward it just to hear. "You will retrieve my family," he said simply, enunciating each word with a precision that made it sound like law itself. "Now." Robert twitched, blinking rapidly, his throat bobbing as he forced himself to nod. His voice cracked on the first word before he managed to find it. "Why, yes, sir," he stammered, the title sounding absurdly inadequate in the hush. He gestured frantically to Sam, the security guard who jumped and moved so quickly he nearly knocked over a sign that rattled and fell to the floor with a clatter that made half the lobby flinch. Sam didn't even try to apologize as he hurried toward the door, vanishing into the side hallway like a man escaping a burning building. Charles didn't bother watching him go. He kept his gaze fixed on Robert like a hawk tracking prey, the silence stretching so long that the discomfort turned to outright dread. Several customers shifted in their chairs, their eyes darting from Charles's face to the exit, as if wondering if they should just flee the building entirely. A minute later, Sam returned with Evelyn, David, and Lila in tow, their faces tight with confusion and exhausted humiliation that hadn't yet given way to hope. Evelyn's eyes were red, but her chin was up. David looked like he was made of coiled wire ready to snap, and Lila still clutched that battered folder, so tight the corners were bending to mush in her fingers. They saw Charles and froze, their eyes widening, Evelyn's mouth opening in a tiny gasp before she slapped a hand over it to stop herself. David's nostrils flared as he fought the instinct to run forward and embrace the one man in the world who could fix this. And Lila let out a single sob before biting her lip, so hard it left an angry red line. Charles didn't say anything, didn't need to. He just flicked his eyes toward them once and gave the smallest, most imperceptible nod in the world. And something uncoiled in Evelyn's spine. David straightened up, and even Lila managed to loosen her death grip on the folder, as if that tiny gesture had given them permission to breathe again. Charles turned back to Robert then, his voice still so calm it felt like an insult. "These are my family," he said, the words landing like hammer blows in the silence. Robert made a pathetic noise in his throat, but didn't dare interrupt. Charles's eyes narrowed slightly, his nostrils flaring as he inhaled once, slow and controlled. Then he began speaking in that same unbroken, unhurried cadence that somehow commanded absolute attention. "As Governor of the Federal Reserve, I am well aware of Redwood National's charter obligations," he said, his voice somehow gaining volume without ever rising, filling the lobby with its authority, including federal regulations against discriminatory banking practices, requirements for the maintenance and integrity of client records, and the criminal penalties for fraudulently tampering with appointment logs and customer communication histories. Robert's face drained of what little color it had left, his mouth opening and closing silently, his eyes darting to the silent tellers behind him who were now watching with open horror, realizing that they were witnessing the collapse of their entire carefully managed illusion of untouchable civility. Charles didn't pause, didn't give Robert a chance to speak or defend himself. Instead, he stepped forward another inch, close enough that Robert had to physically lean back to keep from being nose to nose with him. "You will produce the appointment record you deleted," Charles ordered, voice as soft as ever, but carrying the unmistakable threat of nuclear force. "You will restore all associated communication logs," he continued, "and you will do so immediately, in front of me and every witness in this lobby." Robert made another strangled noise, his eyes darting desperately to Sam and the tellers as if looking for rescue. But none came. They were as frozen as he was. Charles went on as if reading from scripture. "Furthermore," he said, voice dipping even lower, so the hush bent closer to catch every word, "you will initiate an internal investigation into your own conduct." Robert blinked, his mouth working soundlessly, but Charles wasn't finished. "Specifically, your targeting of my family with racially discriminatory assumptions, your misuse of security personnel to intimidate them, your defamatory communications with other branches labeling them as criminals without cause, and your illegal destruction of customer records. Robert looked like he was about to faint, the sweat pouring down his face now in rivulets, one hand trembling on the edge of the counter. But Charles didn't stop, didn't give him so much as a second to recover. You will contact your regional manager and Redwood's legal counsel, he continued, voice so low it was practically a growl, and inform them that a federal investigation into discriminatory banking practices is being prepared. He paused finally, the silence so complete it felt like the building itself was holding its breath. The customers sat, frozen. The tellers stared in horrified awe. Even Sam's posture sagged with the knowledge that the entire charade was over. Charles Robinson didn't move, didn't blink, didn't even breathe for a moment, his dark eyes boring into Robert's with the cold, calm certainty of a man who knew he would get exactly what he wanted. Robert Sanders stood paralyzed behind the counter, sweat soaking through the collar of his once crisp dress shirt, face pale and drawn as Charles Robinson's final words hung in the air like a death sentence. The hush in the bank lobby had taken on a different quality now, less like the fearful silence of people watching a train wreck, and more like the expectant quiet of an audience waiting for the inevitable judgment to fall. No one moved. No one even pretended to go about their business. The customers sat rigid in their chairs, eyes darting between Charles and Robert with morbid fascination. The tellers behind the glass looked like they were afraid to even breathe, and Sam the security guard shifted his weight uncomfortably, realizing there was no way to salvage his performance as an enforcer when his boss was the one being dismantled. Robert's mouth opened and closed soundlessly, the words he wanted refusing to come. And Charles didn't move an inch, didn't break eye contact, didn't so much as blink as he waited for the coward in front of him to do what he was told. Eventually, Robert's fingers twitched and he fumbled with his tablet, his thumb trembling as he scrolled through the system, trying to access the records he'd gleefully deleted just hours before. The hush was broken only by the quiet electronic beeps of the screen and his own ragged breathing, every mistake he'd made unspooling before his eyes with merciless clarity. Charles didn't need to say anything more. His silence was a verdict in itself. By the next morning, Redwood National's corporate offices were in crisis mode. The story had spread like wildfire across internal channels despite desperate attempts to contain it. The security footage, quietly leaked by an anonymous employee who couldn't stomach the hypocrisy any longer, made its way to local news stations where talking heads dissected every humiliating minute of the Robinson family's treatment under the buzzing interrogation room light. Footage of Charles's arrival at the branch, his chilling calm, and Robert's stuttering terror played on an endless loop, framed by banners screaming phrases like Federal Reserve Governor confronts bank racism and discrimination scandal rocks Redwood National. Social media exploded in outrage, hashtags trending within hours as thousands of people shared their own stories of being profiled, marginalized, humiliated in spaces that pretended to be neutral. The bank's carefully cultivated image as a pillar of respectable tradition, disintegrating in real time. The board of directors scrambled to respond, emergency meetings running late into the night in sleek conference rooms where the air smelled of burnt coffee and fear. PR consultants were dragged in. Legal teams flipped through thick binders looking for plausible defenses, but there was none to be found. The footage was too clear, the audio too damning, and the figure of Charles Robinson, unblinking, unbothered, unstoppable, too unimpeachable to attack. They realized with collective dread that there was only one move left if they wanted to save the company from collapse, and so they made it grimly, unanimously, and without ceremony. 2 days later, Redwood National Bank issued a formal statement to every press outlet in the city, the language painstakingly chosen to sound contrite without admitting too much legal liability. But no one was fooled. We at Redwood National Bank extend our deepest apologies to the Robinson family. It began, read in a solemn monotone by the chairman of the board himself on live television, the camera unflinching as it zoomed in on his carefully composed face. What occurred at our downtown branch was unacceptable, inexcusable, and not reflective of the values we hold as an institution. Behind him on a split screen, footage rolled of Robert Sanders' final day. The bank lobby full of hushed employees, Robert standing behind the counter with his badge removed, eyes downcast as two uniformed security guards, his own staff, stood flanking him. The HR director reading aloud his official termination letter with no attempt at privacy, his voice carrying through the building's intercom, so that every teller, every customer, and every gawking employee heard it clearly. Robert Sanders is hereby terminated for gross misconduct, violation of anti-discrimination policies, and breach of Redwood National's Code of Ethics. The words ringing like a bell, tolling the end of his career. No one interrupted. No one offered comfort. The entire branch frozen as they watched a man who had ruled it with an iron fist reduced to a silent, shaking wreck. The bank didn't stop there. It couldn't afford to. The board authorized a public settlement with the Robinson family that was described by reporters as substantial. Though no exact figure was released, rumors swirled of 7 figures, quietly transferred to accounts that couldn't be frozen or flagged this time. Evelyn Robinson accepted the apology with visible disgust, her hair pulled back and her eyes shining cold under the bright lights of the press conference. Lila clutching her hand. David, standing at her shoulder like a bodyguard, daring anyone to try them again. Redwood National's CEO stood beside them, forced to read prepared remarks acknowledging systemic bias, vowing reforms, his voice trembling with the knowledge that every word was being broadcast live to a public ready to pounce on any hint of insincerity. He finished with a grimace. "We will be implementing mandatory anti-discrimination training for all employees," he said, the words tasting like ashes in his mouth. "We are committed to restoring the trust we have broken." And in the back of the room, reporters shouted questions he refused to answer, their voices rising with barely suppressed fury. But the punishment didn't end with money or words. Redwood National Bank was slapped with a regulatory investigation announced by the Office of the Comptroller of the Currency before the ink was dry on the settlement check. Federal auditors began poring over their records with relentless thoroughness, hunting for any sign of similar misconduct, any other patterns of discrimination buried under spreadsheets and sanitized emails. Branch managers across the region who had received Robert's infamous warning, "Watch out, they might try this scam elsewhere," were called in for mandatory interviews, their faces pale as they realized their casual complicity was now evidence. Redwood's legal team worked overtime issuing terrified denials, insisting those managers had misinterpreted the instructions, but no one was buying it, especially not Charles Robinson, who sat in his office in Washington with the full authority of the Federal Reserve behind him, reading every report with cold precision, already preparing the next steps to ensure Redwood National, and any other bank watching, understood exactly how expensive it would be to treat his family or anyone like them that way ever again. The days and weeks after Redwood National's very public reckoning were unkind to Robert Sanders in ways he hadn't imagined when he'd first stood behind that marble counter, smugly directing security to watch the Robinson family like criminals. The day he was fired still haunted him like a bad dream replaying on an endless loop, the words of his own HR director echoing through the building on the intercom for all to hear. The security guards flanking him like prison escorts, the hush in the lobby filled not with respect or sympathy, but the sickly quiet of people pretending they hadn't enjoyed watching his fall. It didn't matter how many times he told himself he'd only been following policy, that he'd just been cautious, because deep down he remembered every word he'd said, the way he'd savored humiliating them, the false smiles, the snide remarks meant to sting, and worst of all the moment Charles Robinson's calm, unblinking stare had stripped every excuse bare and left Robert shaking with the knowledge of what he really was. After that day, Redwood National made sure he was a pariah, not because they changed overnight into better people, but because they had to. They needed a scapegoat, a sacrifice to prove they were serious about change. His name went on internal blacklists so quietly and thoroughly that every other bank in town knew not to touch him. The industry grapevine made sure his resume was trashed before the interview was even scheduled. He tried lying about what happened, tried leaving it off his work history, but there was always someone who recognized his face from the news footage, someone who had watched him smirk over that tablet and heard him say, "You people should know your place." Robert found himself sitting in dingy coffee shops for hours filling out job applications for positions he once would have sneered at: assistant manager at a payday loan place, teller at a check cashing shack with bulletproof glass. No one wanted him, not even them. Eventually, the money ran low enough that the mortgage went unpaid. His spotless credit wrecked. The shiny car repossessed in the dead of night while he watched from the blinds with his heart in his throat. And he found himself sleeping on a friend's couch, lying about. Looking for work while staring at the ceiling all night, replaying every moment in that bank like a personal hell on loop. He didn't plan to apologize, not at first. He told himself for months that they didn't deserve it, that it wouldn't matter, that they wouldn't accept it even if he did. But every time he closed his eyes, he saw Evelyn's face pale with humiliation, David's trembling hands gripping the counter, Lila's tears she tried so hard to hide. And over he heard his own voice mocking them, belittling them, making them small. It was worse than unemployment, worse than the public disgrace. The knowledge that he'd been exactly what they accused him of, that he'd lived down to every vile expectation. Finally, one cold morning when his friend told him he needed to move out by the end of the month, Robert lay awake on the sagging sofa, staring at the ceiling, the decision heavy in his chest like a stone, and he sat up slowly, rubbing his face with calloused hands, whispering to the empty room, "I have to make it right." He didn't know if he even could, but he knew he had to try. It took weeks of effort to find them, not because they hid, but because he'd burned every bridge that might have helped. Redwood National refused to pass along a letter. Their legal team outright laughed at him over the phone. Finally, he heard from a former coworker that the Robinsons were working on something big, that they'd taken part of their settlement money and used it to establish a community foundation dedicated to teaching underprivileged kids about financial literacy and justice. The irony of it made his stomach hurt. His own cruelty had indirectly funded something better than he'd ever built in all his years of chasing quarterly bonuses. He scraped together bus fare, straightened the cheapest suit he owned, and went to find them on the day of the foundation's opening ceremony. A bright autumn afternoon where the sky was so blue it hurt. He stood at the edge of the crowd with his heart pounding in his throat, watching David shake hands with local officials, Lila, older, now taller, more composed, helping kids pick out new backpacks with the foundation's logo, and Evelyn at the center, greeting every guest with the calm, regal dignity he tried so hard to strip from her in that bank lobby. Robert swallowed hard and took a step forward, then another, the crowd parting around him in slow ripples, as people recognized the face they'd seen on TV months ago. He heard whispers, felt the pointed fingers, but he didn't stop, he didn't run. He walked until he stood in front of Evelyn and David and Lila, who all went quiet at once, their eyes narrowing in unison, David's shoulders tensing as if ready to throw him out physically. Robert tried to speak, and his voice cracked humiliatingly. "So," he swallowed and tried again, this time quieter, rawer. "I don't expect forgiveness," he said, voice shaking. I just needed to say it to your face. I was wrong. I was so wrong about everything." He squeezed his eyes shut, not daring to look at them as the words tumbled out. "I was cruel. I lied. I humiliated you. I did it because I thought I could get away with it. Because I wanted to feel powerful." His voice cracked again, and he let it. "I'm sorry. I am so sorry." For a long moment no one spoke, the air thick with the weight of a silence that felt like judgment itself. Evelyn blinked slowly, her eyes glittering with something complicated. Something that wasn't quite forgiveness, but wasn't hatred either. David's jaw worked, his fists clenching and unclenching at his sides. And Lila let out a single, shaky breath, wiping at her eyes before she could stop herself. Finally, Evelyn's voice cut the quiet. Calm and clear. "You can't undo what you did," she said. And Robert flinched as if slapped, but she continued. "But you can decide what you do next." He nodded rapidly, swallowing tears that threatened to spill. "Anything," he rasped. "I'll do anything." Weeks later, Robert found himself in a small community room, wearing a second-hand dress shirt and tie, standing in front of a battered whiteboard where half a dozen kids sat watching him with skeptical eyes. He cleared his throat nervously and adjusted his collar before picking up the marker. "Okay," he said with a shaky smile, "let's talk about how banks work and how they should work." Behind the glass door, Evelyn and David watched in silence. Evelyn's arm looped through her son's as they listened to the man who had once humiliated them, teaching kids how to demand better, to recognize unfair treatment, to know their worth and rights. Redwood National's hush money settlement had funded the program, but it was Robert's shame, his reckoning, that gave it its soul. And as he spoke in halting, honest tones about what he'd done wrong and how these kids could do better, the foundation found its truest mission, not just teaching financial literacy, but forging justice out of the ashes of humiliation, one lesson at a time. If you enjoyed this story and want to see more, make sure to like and subscribe to stay updated. I'd love to know, what was the most surprising moment for you? Which part of the story hit hardest? Tell me in the comments, and let us know where you're watching from. I always enjoy seeing how far these stories travel.